Welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV, recorded on Thursday, March the 17th. On this week's show, the government is seeking to renew its emergency pandemic powers. But where's the emergency? I'll be speaking to former Supreme Court Judge Jonathan Sumption. And where's the opposition? The Spectator's political team will analyse the many troubles of Labour Party leader Keir Starmer. We'll also talk Irish travellers. Are they still being discriminated against? And former Brexit Secretary David Davis will join us to talk about his Commons intervention in the ongoing surgeon salmon civil war. All that to come in the next hour of top analysis and debate. As always, if you subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel, and why wouldn't you? It's free. You'll never miss a program. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen now. A very special thanks to Charles Stanley for their continued support of the Week in 60 Minutes. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. We're delighted to be partners with them. Now, next week, the government will seek to renew its emergency COVID powers for another 6 months, even though the vaccine rollout continues on target, hospitalizations and deaths are collapsing, and in 3 months, the final COVID restrictions are expected to go in England. So why the need for emergency powers through to the autumn? I'll be speaking shortly to Jonathan Sumption, but first, let's go to Kate Andrews, our economics correspondent. She edits the Spectator's daily lunchtime briefing, which contains all that you need to know about each day's latest COVID news. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. As you say, MPs are set to debate and extend the emergency powers before the Easter break. And this has prompted a deep dive into the data to look at how we're really tackling COVID-19 in the UK at the moment. As you can see from this first slide, the 7-day average for infections has been on a steady decline, now sitting around where infections were in early to mid-September last year. And here in the second slide, you can see that hospitalizations are on an even steeper decline. And this is looking at the number of patients admitted to hospital, which is now down to where it was in early October. And this has certainly been helped by the vaccine rollout, which is preventing not just against catching COVID-19, but of course serious reactions to the virus, which can lead to hospitalization. And sadly, death. Although if we look at this third chart here, deaths again clearly in a steady decline as well, with the 7-day average now reflecting where we were in early to mid-October last year as well. Now, sadly, this is not the story that is reflected everywhere else. The UK, as you can see from this next chart, has one of the lowest case rates in Europe. This week, Italy put much of the country back into red zones, a very restrictive form of lockdown as another wave hits. France is expected to extend lockdown measures into the Paris region in the days to come. And the Czech Republic has even been relying on the hospital capacity of other countries to treat their patients. Now, much of what is behind this is Europe's struggle with their vaccine rollout. And you can see from this last slide that the UK continues not just to be a leader in Europe, but a leader worldwide when it comes to this jab race. There were worrying indications yesterday that we may be looking at a slowdown of our vaccine rate in the month ahead, a reminder that the story is far from over. But when we're debating the extraordinary government powers, you can see how one could certainly make the case that parts of Europe are experiencing a state of emergency, but that argument is becoming much more difficult to make here in the UK, at least right now. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Kate. It's kind of a striking graph there of between Britain and the rest of the other European Union countries. Tell us a bit more, if you can, about this AstraZeneca vaccine shortage, if it is a vaccine shortage. Some sort of scare stories in the London papers this morning.
I think in short, Andrew, yes, it is a bit worrying. We got this leaked letter yesterday from NHS England to local vaccine suppliers saying that they were expecting supply to be more limited in the month ahead. It's thought that part of the reason for this is a delay in getting roughly 5 million doses of AstraZeneca from India, that there's been a delay on the export from India, which is disappointing news, especially for those who haven't had their first jab yet, because in this letter it states that there should should be a pause on offering people appointments to get their first jab. Although it's insistent if you've had your first jab, you shouldn't worry, your second one is still coming. Now, ministers have been quick to say that this is just part of the process, that the vaccine rollout is going to have its peaks and troughs and people shouldn't be worried. And they're also insistent that their deadlines they're sticking to when it comes to the top 9 most vulnerable categories of people being inoculated by the 15th of April, and then for all adults to have gotten their first jab by the end of July. But I do think this is an important reminder that while things are going so well, and as you saw in that chart about the vaccine race, the UK really is a world leader, the race is not over. We're still going, and there's still many hurdles that we have to overcome. So unfortunately, it looks like there could be a bit of a slowdown in April, but other vaccines are expected to come online in the spring. We don't have specific details yet, but we should be looking at the Moderna vaccine, hopefully in the near future, so things could pick up as well.
Well, there are a lot of European countries sitting on a huge batch of AstraZeneca vaccine that they say they don't want to use because they think it doesn't work very well. Can we not just get them to send over the stuff they don't want?
Yeah, this is becoming a bit of a circus in the European Union. For months now, you have had Ursula von der Leyen and you've had major European leaders undermining confidence in the AstraZeneca vaccine and indeed in the UK's rollout of vaccines full stop, suggesting that our nimble regulator perhaps skipped over some safety precautions for which there is absolutely no evidence. You had Germany, you had France suggesting, I think it was Macron said that the vaccine was quasi-effective for the over 65s. Again, no evidence for this. Now we're in a very strange position where many of these EU countries are on the one hand complaining that AstraZeneca hasn't been giving them the supplies that were promised, and they're in a rage about this, and then on the other hand suggesting that they have to pause this vaccine because they're not sure about the safety standards. What I would say in defense of the EU is that the European Medicines Agency is adamant that this vaccine is safe and that it should be administered to all of the adult age groups, and they're pleading with European countries to start up the rollout of AstraZeneca again if it's been paused. So in many cases it's not the EU, although there have been moments I think from leaders in the EU that have undermined this process, but individual European leaders. And it's frustrating because it seems political in many of these circumstances. It just seems like they're getting in line, following one after the next, following what their neighbors are doing, but it isn't necessarily in the best interest of the nations.
The problem is that even if the European medical authorities say it's okay, and everybody expects that that's exactly what they're going to do, I'm afraid Chancellor Merkel and President Macron have poisoned the well. Opinion polls in France, for example, show that there's a substantial minority of French people who just won't take AstraZeneca now. I mean, they will not find this easy, Kate, to roll back. They have already changed public opinion, and public opinion won't dance to their tune now. I think as Europe is hit by a third wave, as your figures show, this is a real crisis for Europe, I would suggest.
I fear deeply, Andrew, that people who are vulnerable to this virus, people who could end up in hospitalization, even sadly end up dead from this virus, may be put off getting the vaccine because of what these major European leaders have said. I think you're right. It's very hard to roll back now because it's not the first instance that they've done it. They've been doing it for months.
No, and whereas we're talking about how to get out of lockdown, all the talk in the major European countries is going back into lockdown. Italy has already done it. President Macron has defied his experts so far, but is now under huge pressure to have a third lockdown. My own view is that by the weekend, the Ile-de-France, it's essentially the greater Paris region, that will be in lockdown. And perhaps the Haute-de-France too, up around Calais and the northeast of France as well. And it seems that if you haven't vaccinated enough of your population, and you are faced with this third wave, then you go back into lockdown. That's what Europe is facing, with all that now means for delaying economic recovery and getting people back to work. That's what I mean by this being a full, for me, this seems, Kate, to be the biggest crisis of Europe since the Eurozone crisis way back in 2013.
Well, Andrew, I think you're right, because all of the principles that they held and also the practicalities, the things that are supposed to be benefits of being in the European Union, seem to be falling apart. And a lot of that horrendously has come down to the attitudes, the political attitudes of leaders towards getting their nations vaccinated. I would note that the UK is still in one of the strictest lockdowns in the developed world, even though Europe, as the slides show, is facing more of the crisis at the moment. The UK government is being extremely cautious about coming out of lockdown. So when we talk about Europe going back in, they're going to be facing some measures that we're already living under here in the UK. So I think the lockdown point is actually a very interesting one, because you have countries that are in a far greater state of emergency than the UK, and yet the UK is in this very strict lockdown and is set to be under lockdown measures for months to come.
Can you give any possible explanation as to why the European Commission wants to ban the export of AstraZeneca, or is threatening to ban the export of the AstraZeneca vaccine, while at the same time saying it doesn't want to use AstraZeneca? I mean, that just, I just don't understand the logic of that.
Well, I think you're seeing desperation. I mean, when a supposedly free market bloc starts talking about seizing private assets, private materials like vaccines, essentially, to use for their own people, when they're undermining contract law in that way, you have to chalk that up to absolute desperation. But this is where you are seeing a divide, I think, between the Commission and individual EU countries, because, as I said, that the European Medicines Agency is insistent that this vaccine is safe and that it works for all adult age categories. And they're very hopeful, I think, that some of these other EU countries, major EU countries that have a lot of soft power influence, will change their minds in the near future and start using it again. So I imagine they're hopeful that if they have the supply, it will be rolled out. But as you say, Andrew, so much has been done to undermine the credibility of this vaccine in the EU. It's very difficult to see how they just reverse that overnight.
It is indeed. We'll need to keep an eye on this. Kate, thank you for joining us. Kate Andrews there, our economics correspondent. There's a lot going on in Europe at the moment. A lot of it's politics rather than science. The Chancellor Merkel, her party was thumped in two major regional elections just the last weekend there. There is a widespread talk in Germany now that the CDU may not form part of the German government after the federal elections in September. There is a crisis now in Chancellor Merkel's CDU, and President Macron, the latest polls show that he is now nip and tuck with Marine Le Pen of the hard right National Front, both around 50%, 48 to 52%. So there are major problems going on there. Meanwhile, we learn that $500 billion left the Eurozone region in the fourth quarter of 2020, before the whole vaccine mess clicked in. And there is widespread expectation in financial circles that a lot more than $500 billion will leave the Eurozone in the first quarter of this year. It's beginning to look a little bit more like capital flight is beginning to take place from the Eurozone. Anyway, one man who's been vocal on this side of the channel in his criticism of the government's approach is Jonathan Sumption. He's a former Supreme Court judge. He joins us now. Jonathan Sumption, welcome to Spectator TV.
Morning.
Do you not have any sympathy with the government on its slow approach to coming out of the lockdown, which you could defend as a better safe than sorry approach?
Well, the government's position throughout, right from last March, has been that it will not discriminate between people according to their different levels of vulnerability. So it has locked down healthy people and young people who are at very small risk of getting seriously ill, let alone dying. And it has adhered to that throughout. What we are seeing now is that an even bigger anomaly about this approach, because with more than a third of the population vaccinated, including a very high proportion of all the most vulnerable people, they are still saying that everybody has got to be treated in exactly the same way, whether they are vulnerable to this disease or not. I think we are now reaching the stage when people are going to start losing patience with this.
It's clear that there is a third wave about. We see that most of all in continental Europe. Because their vaccine rollout has been slow, it's going to hit them worse, hit Britain less because of the success so far of our vaccine program. In the circumstances we now find ourselves in, what would you like the government to do going forward into spring and early summer?
I think that they should now recognise that it is a lot more efficient and effective for each of us to make our own risk assessments, because our positions are too different to allow for anything else. Some of us have had the disease already, some of us have been vaccinated, some of us are young, some old, some healthy, some not. A one-size-fits-all approach is no longer a defensible way of approaching this. We have got to make a risk assessment for ourselves and those immediately around us.
What would happen if that then led to a huge spike in cases and deaths?
I think that it's unlikely to lead to a huge spike. I would certainly accept that it might lead to a small one, but we have to be prepared to take risks because of the enormous collateral costs. Even if you simply confine yourself to the position of the health sector, we are looking at a significant increase in diseases like dementia and cancer, which are also killers. But actually, this isn't just a public health issue. It's an economic issue, it's a moral issue, it's an educational issue, it's a social issue. We've got to face the fact that it may be worth putting up with a modest increase in the death toll in order to be able to have an economy that functions, an educational system that functions. We simply have to accept that no country ever saved lives by making itself poorer.
The government, though, is very influenced, I would suggest, by what happened last summer and into early autumn. By last summer, we thought things were going to open out, and we had that eat out scheme where you were subsidized to go to the local restaurant. Things seemed to be beginning to get back to normal. The economy was beginning to pick up too. And then suddenly cases started to rise again and deaths started to rise again. And the government delayed bringing in more lockdown procedures then. And it's being accused now, as a result of that, increasing deaths because it was so slow to act, to move in to further lockdown. Isn't it right that the government should take notice of its previous experience when it didn't go so well?
Of course, but we have to look rather carefully at what its previous experience was. Right from the outset, indeed in the notorious Imperial College statistical projection produced in the middle of March last year, the government was told that lockdowns only work if they are kept in place permanently until there's a vaccine. So actually the government had a choice. It could say at last March, we will now have a lockdown that will last for as long as it takes to get the vaccine, or it might as well forget the lockdown altogether. Because the reality is, as the Imperial College study quite clearly showed, is that if you have a lockdown and then lift it, what happens is that the lives that you've saved during the lockdown, the deaths are simply shunted into a later period. Now, I doubt whether the British people, even in their relatively submissive mood of last year, would have tolerated the government saying, we are going to lock you all down for what may be anything up to 18 months or at least a year. But that was the choice that they had. The reality is that if more people who were young and healthy had got the disease during the summer, when they were most unlikely, these are categories that are most unlikely to become seriously ill or die, many more of them would have had a natural immunity at the time when the more virulent strains came in during the autumn. I don't think it's at all clear that this policy worked when the lockdown was in force. I don't think it's at all clear that if the lockdown had been kept permanently in place, it would have been complied with. The fact is, a lockdown can work if it is 1, total, and 2, indefinite in duration. And that would have done even more catastrophic damage to our educational sector and our economy, and to the health of people in respect of other diseases than what we've suffered anyway.
And yet the British government is not alone in not following your advice when it comes to lockdown. Almost every major government in the democratic world has been forced into lockdowns, various forms of them. Politicians, governments of very different political hues, whether it's Governor Cuomo in New York, or President Macron in France, or Chancellor Merkel in Germany, or whoever was Prime Minister back then. I can't remember then, it's now Mr. Draghi, but back then, whoever was Prime Minister in Italy, they had to do lockdowns too, particularly in the north. I mean, there has to be something to the argument that if all these governments saw that was the right way, there has to be something in that.
Only if they were making an independent judgment. In fact, what was happening is that they were all copying each other because they were afraid that their own populations would say, oh, look, in the country next door they're doing this, why aren't you doing something similar? The fact is that before the lockdowns were ordered, all governments that had done serious studies about this, including our own, had a policy based on serious scientific advice that they would not lock people down. You can take our example, for example, and I'll mention Germany in a moment. In this country, we had been planning for an event exactly like this for more than 10 years. It was top of the National Risk Register. In 2011, a detailed plan, which was kept regularly up to date, was prepared as to how to deal with it. And the basic principles behind that plan were, first of all, that you did not use coercion, you used advice to the population, but you allowed them to make their own risk assessments. And secondly, that you did not isolate or take abrasive measures against the healthy. You concentrated on isolating the infectious and the sick. Now, strikingly enough, exactly the same principles lay behind the German National Pandemic Plan, which was drawn up by the Robert Koch Institute, which is a highly respected body. They all, those that have published plans, worked along exactly the same lines, and the World Health Organization also recommended exactly that approach. So what we have here is governments independently forming the view that they should take a less abrasive attitude to major pandemics, and then all copying each other and throwing out the window 10 years worth of careful scientific and administrative planning. That does not do credit to any of these governments. They basically jettisoned their own research. Now, I've heard it said that nobody expected that there would be any pandemic, anything like as serious as this. I'm afraid that is simply untrue. The 2017 edition of the National Risk Register in this country envisaged that a new pathogen might cause deaths up to 750,000. Not even Professor Ferguson has suggested that the deaths would have been anything like that on any of the various hypotheses. So what we have actually done is to reject the scientific approach, to adopt a policy that fails to discriminate between different degrees of vulnerability, and that is scientifically disreputable. The reason why this is happening is the fear of populations across Europe and their belief that if their governments are not doing something abrasive and hyperactive about it, they are going to sleep on the job. That's never been true. They had very careful plans and they should have adhered to them.
Final question for you. Do you see a link, as some do, a link between a government that has now presided over a variety of lockdowns for a year now and this new policing bill, which would seem to, in various ways, crib and confine our ability to protest and demonstrate peacefully?
I don't see much of a link. I think there's a good deal of press reporting to suggest, and it sounds plausible, that the Home Secretary was much exercised by protests against the lockdown. And if that is true, then it may well be that there is a link. But actually, the issues raised in the current bill have been around for a long time. Parts of the bill are perfectly acceptable in my view, and parts of it are not. The bits that aren't acceptable are the bits that give an altogether excessive discretion to both the police and the Home Secretary. We ought not to have laws that are defined entirely by the Home Secretary, who is now, under this bill, it's proposed to give her powers to say what constitutes sufficient disruption to constitute a criminal offence. We ought not to allow policemen on the hoof to decide which protests they will curtail and which they will not. On the other hand, other parts of the bill are perfectly respectable, because it seems to me that a person's right to protest stops short at the point when they have to trample on other people's rights to go about their ordinary business. And the creation of a public nuisance offence seems to me to be a desirable and healthy step.
Jonathan Sumption, thank you for that. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Pleasure.
Now, politics. This week's Spectator cover story, written by our political editor, James Forsyth, takes a look at just why Keir Starmer's Labour leadership has been so, well, lackluster, I guess is the polite way of putting it. Let's go straight to James. James, why is Keir Starmer struggling?
Because I think Keir Starmer essentially made a bet that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. And so his whole argument against the government was based around competence. And last November, that seemed to be paying off. Labour had drawn level in the polls with the Conservatives. But the vaccine rollout has shifted things round, given the government a boost, and Labour are now trailing. And I think the other point is that people don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. I think he's begun to get the message out, but he's not Jeremy Corbyn. But what is Starmerism is still a question that leaves most voters scratching their heads.
Let's bring in Katie Bowles, the Spectator's deputy political editor. She's been listening to James there. She's also written part of what we call the sidebar on this week's cover story. Katie, you say that Keir Starmer is playing a long game. What does that mean? What's the long game?
I think what it means is, I think that could be a charitable interpretation in terms of the long game. But I think what this ultimately means is, if you look to when the next election is going to be, so the fact it could be a couple of years away, definitely, even if it is 2023, as some people are talking about, that's a long time. And I think what the leaders' office believe is that they have so much to fix from the Jeremy Corbyn legacy that actually they need to focus on party management before they get to the point that they're really making the case to the public. But I think adding to that, the pandemic. Now, lots of people would say with a death toll over 100,000 and really one of the worst economic performances in Europe, there's lots to attack the government on. But what you frequently hear from shadow cabinet members as well as various aides is that pandemic politics is much harder. And in all their focus groups, they just hear that voters want the government to succeed and they don't want Labour to look opportunistic. And that is creating a problem whereby they don't think they actually can attack the government as they want to.
Could be, James, of course, the long game is very long. After the disastrous for Labour winter of discontent in 1979, they were not back in power until 1997. And after the pretty lackluster years of John Major, who lost to Mr. Blair in 1997, the Tories weren't back in power till 2010. And even then, it had to be in coalition with the Lib Dems. We may have underestimated the huge damage, generational damage perhaps, that Jeremy Corbyn has done to the Labour Party.
Yeah, I think one of the other problems for Labour is that at the next election, you'd have thought Labour would be able to say the Tories have been in power for 14 years. And as you were just articulating, once a party's been in power for that long, you can lay every single problem at their door and say if they haven't fixed it already, they're not going to. I think one of the challenges for Labour is that because of COVID and the pandemic, I think the Tory argument in the next election will be we're 3 or 4 years into a kind of rebuilding plan, a recovery plan post-COVID, and so we need time to finish the job. And so I think the Tories are going for a 5th term, which is unprecedented in recent modern British political history. But some of that time for a change argument for Labour is going to be blunted by the fact that the government will be talking about how they are 4 years into their 10-year rebuilding plan.
Katie, one area where you would think traditionally Labour, particularly the civil human rights element of the Labour Party, would have been up in arms is over the police bill that I was talking to Lord Sumption about there. That's, I would have thought, something that Labour really could get its teeth into. And of course, the demonstrations around the death of Sarah Everard as well would give them some locus on that. But they seem very reluctant to take the government on in this subject.
Yes, completely. And they only made the decision to really oppose that and offer opposition after what happened at the weekend at the Sarah Everard vigil. But even without that, you would have thought this is something where Labour might be able to find their voice. And I think this is where you see Keir Starmer slightly torn, because on the one hand, particularly if you look at his track record, you would think individual liberties would be something that Keir Starmer want to push for, particularly if that means protest groups that have been overlooked. But on the other, the thing the Leader's Office really wants to do is, as one put it to me, make sure people don't think we're mad. And part of that is this idea that Keir Starmer is a patriot and Labour can be trusted with law and order. And I think almost that latter concern about trying to show that this is a respectable party and actually on things like the police, Labour are where they should be, is holding them back on things that would actually be Labour values.
James, it could be it's simply mission impossible for Keir Starmer, that it's just the times that we are in. The government, Mr. Johnson, has had a huge bounce because of the success of the vaccine rollout. Let's assume that continues. There's a halo effect on that takes the government into 2022. The Office for Budget Responsibility is predicting 7% plus growth in 2022, huge job creation, rising living standards. It could be more than 7%. I see the Fed has updated its forecast for the United States, and we're in roughly a similar position coming out of the recovery. So you've got this massive economic growth, households spending money again in 2022. That takes you into 2023. Why not call a snap or an election either in late spring or early autumn of 2023, which as things look at now, it doesn't matter what Keir Starmer does, the Tories would probably win that.
Yeah, look, I think it is very challenging for him. But I also think that the other point from Keir Starmer is, the Duke of Wellington said there's only one thing half as melancholy as a battle lost, and that's a battle won. And I think when the smoke clears and we see the economic situation post-COVID, it won't look quite so rosy. There will undoubtedly be an increase in private sector unemployment. There'll be huge backlogs in the NHS, in the court system. There'll be lost learning in education. And the government will be worried about inflation and what that might do to the cost of servicing the national debt. So it won't be able to kind of throw money at every problem in the way that Joe Biden is doing in the US. So I think there is actually... I think that you painted one very plausible scenario. There is a more favourable scenario to Labour coming out, where all of the problems post-COVID become apparent, and because the government has been in power and took the decisions it can't get away from them, and Labour can attack them on that. So I think that's an opportunity. I think the other challenge for Labour is Scotland. It's very hard to see how Labour can win a majority without a revival in Scotland. Now, in Anna Sarwar, they have a new, more impressive Scottish Labour leader than they've had in some time. But I think that's a real problem for them, because even if the Tories and Labour were close in the polls going into the next election, that would raise the whole question as to whether Labour would be prepared to do a deal with the SNP to govern at Westminster. And one thing we have discovered in the last few elections is that association is particularly toxic in the minds of English and Welsh voters.
Katie, final question on this segment to you. It could be that Keir Starmer is a decent man doing the best he can in very difficult circumstances, given what he inherited from the Corbyn Labour Party. And I would suggest, and I know you've been speaking to a number of them, so you will know better than me, it isn't just a problem if there is a problem with the Labour leadership. It's a problem with his shadow cabinet too. I mean, how can I be polite about the shadow cabinet? I mean, it's up against a cabinet that's not exactly a five-star Johnson cabinet, but the shadow cabinet itself is distinctly underwhelming.
Yes, I think most people don't really know who is in the shadow cabinet. I think probably one of the biggest names is Ed Miliband. And I think if you had said a few years ago that would be Labour's star player after the general election, people would have been slightly surprised or bewildered. I think that there are problems there. I think that there are lots of Labour MPs who want to tell you there are problems there and there has to be a shadow cabinet reshuffle. That's partly because they want to be in that and to get positions. But there is a problem with cut through. Now, what you will hear as a defence is in a pandemic, it's very hard to get cut through, but of course Joe Biden managed to win an election in a pandemic. I think in terms of the shadow cabinet, the one to watch is Annalise Dodds, because I think of all the people who receive the most criticism, it's the shadow chancellor. And we recently saw in the budget, when it comes to the freezing of the various thresholds, you had a situation where Annalise Dodds said the party was going to support that, only for a few days later Lisa Nandy, the shadow foreign secretary, to do a Sunday morning round saying they were going to oppose it. And I think things like that are just adding to this sense that perhaps that person will not be the person going to bat for the party in the Treasury at the next election.
Right, Katie, we'll leave it there. I think you said it all when you said that Ed Miliband was the best known of the shadow cabinet members. I think there's no more to say after you said that. James and Katie, thanks for joining us today. Now, holidays beckon post-lockdown this summer, but with unvaccinated Europe in the grip of a COVID third wave, the Costa del Sol or the French Riviera might be a gamble. So why not a windswept British holiday camp like Pontins? None of you have an Irish name. They decided they were not to be welcomed in an apparent attempt to keep out Irish travellers. It's a bizarre story. Joining me is one would-be victim of Pontins' baffling ban, Melanie McDonagh, who writes about the ban in this week's issue. Melanie, welcome to Spectator TV. Have you managed to establish what thought process, what decision-taking process ever led Pontins to take this decision in the first place?
Well, I don't think it's terribly difficult to work it out. I mean, they were looking for traveller names, but you do need to be exceptionally sophisticated, perhaps even more so than Pontins' management, to be able to work out the most common traveller names and to try and distinguish them from the general Irish population. The list included, it excluded, funnily enough, the O'Neills, who obviously feature largely in Northern Ireland, but it did have McDonald's.
They're a troublesome bunch, I tell you.
They're a very troublesome bunch, up for a fight at any time.
Anywhere near Pontins.
Very bad reputation. Yes, they should have been barred as well. But the McDonaghs are one of the very few names that are actually very specifically traveller. So when you hear the surname McDonagh, the automatic association is with the Tinkers. And I'm sure that was what Pontins were trying to do. In their instruction to the employees at the reception, they did suggest that if they have any trouble, to try and get hold of somebody from management who'd be able to listen into the conversation and decide whether the person was going to be barred. And in that case, you're relying on another signaler, which is the distinctive diction of travellers or tinkers, because the way the community talks is slightly different from that of other Irish people. So it does require a very keen sort of social antennae and a very specific knowledge of place names in relation to places for them actually to pinpoint travellers. And this list of 40 names manages to alienate practically every the Irish person in Britain, because it's extraordinarily comprehensive. And as I mentioned in the piece, that would see off Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and also Terence Leahy, the former head of Tesco's. So tragically, they won't be going to Pontins either. No,
though I don't think it's a huge loss for them. I didn't quite think that Governor Carney would have Pontins high up in his holiday wish list. But they really didn't see that there's a difference between Irish names and travellers. It didn't dawn on them.
Well, it seems not. It is actually very difficult because in different parts of the country you will have different names associated with travellers. As I say, in the west of Ireland, McDonaghs are a very substantial traveller group, but in other parts of the country it might be Ward, in other parts of the country it might be Lynch. So they're treading on very difficult territory there in trying to make the distinction, which of course they shouldn't be making in the first place.
Does Pontins have a track record of a bad experience with travellers? Has it had travellers on holiday there and it hasn't worked out too well? Is there any evidence
they've
of
been
that?
very shy about explaining their motivation for some reason that escapes me. But one would assume that, yes, this is the case. But it may well be just the generic discrimination that travellers get from everyone. I mean, in Ireland, it's exactly the same. They're excluded from entertainment venues and from pubs and from pretty well anywhere where there might be a gathering. There's one Irish comedian who's actually uniquely a stand-up comedian who's a traveller, and he was saying whenever he tries to book a venue or his agent tries to book a venue, everywhere is booked up until 2027 because nobody actually wants him, because they think that travellers will join the audience and have a fight. In fact, he said the only people who were remotely rowdy during his gigs were people from the settled community, and the travellers were model members of the audience.
This is surely against all the human rights laws and the Equalities Acts.
Well, indeed. You have to worry about them, really, because only an idiot would have actually written it down. But as I say, the practice, if not the listing, is extraordinarily widespread. And you're going to find it in Ireland as well as in Britain. But the Equalities and Human Rights Commission did have a quiet word with them, and they said that they'd taken note of the observations and they'd be amending their practice.
Oh, so they've rolled back a bit, Melanie.
Yeah, they might roll back a bit, so I might be in with a chance.
You may be. It's worth at least calling. We could take the call and see how they handle you. In fact, we could both try and get it. I can go as O'Neill and see what they say.
Yes, you try for the O'Neills and I'll try for the McDonaghs and see how we get on.
I'm surprised that there hasn't been a far bigger corporate backlash against Pontins. It's clear that even the human rights campaigners don't give much credence to travellers' problems. It's just as well, I could imagine the outcry would be rather different if Pontins said it was banning all Jamaican names.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it doesn't bear thinking about. I mean, there'd be war. But this kind of is symptomatic of the condition of the travellers generally, because there was a report recently by the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, which said that an extraordinary number of travellers just experience routine discrimination. I mean, in 6 different countries in the EU. But over half of them said they never dream of reporting it to the police because they just don't think that anything would happen. It's so routine, harassment and abuse and discrimination, that they just think, well, why bother talking about it?
All right, we'll leave it there. I'm sure there's a few corporate meetings going on at Pontins to work out how to get out of this mess. Melanie, thank you for marking our card on it. It's a strange story indeed. Melanie McDonagh, not banned from Spectator TV, but could have trouble getting into Pontins if she so desired it. Now, our final segment, Scotland. The former Brexit Secretary David Davis made a significant intervention in the Commons this week, invoking parliamentary privilege. He revealed new information passed on to him by a whistleblower on the salmon sturgeon stramash, good Scottish word that, in Scotland, casting yet more doubt on Nicola Sturgeon's version of events. He joins me now, together with Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, another Scot, which this week carries a powerful editorial on the matter. Welcome to you both. David Davis first, why did you decide to get involved?
Well, sort of 2 things were happening in parallel. Firstly, you had the 2 trials that Alex Salmond went through. I mean, the civil trial, which he won by a spectacular margin, punitive cost given and so on. And the other one, the criminal trial. Now, whenever somebody you're friendly with goes on trial, I always suspend my judgment for the duration. I try not to come to a view either way. But again, despite 14 charges, he's exonerated of all of them. I thought, this is something odd's going on here. So I started to pay attention to it. That was the sort of first half. But the other thing is watching the behaviour of the Scottish Government. I mean, your paper, the Spectator, and in fact, you wrote in the Daily Mail on it and so on. So all of those things came together, and I started to look at it and ask around and see what was going on and so on. And then I got sent a package of papers, which was the Sue Ruddock texts, and I started to unpick it all, and it became clear to me that something was wrong in the state of Scotland, basically.
What I'm uncertain about in this interview is what you can talk about that you talked about in Parliament covered by privilege and what you can't talk about because you're not now covered by privilege and neither is Spectator TV. Do you have a clear idea what you can say to us today?
Up to a point, but look, one of the interesting things that's been happening in Scotland is the behaviour of the Crown Office, right? And the Crown Office, in my view, has been stretching, even in Scottish law, has been stretching its powers to the limit, asserting to everybody from journalists to Salmon's lawyers to the Holyrood Committee that they can't publish this, they can't summon that, they can't do this or that. Actually, things properly done by a court, not by a prosecuting authority. Remember, they're the equivalent of the CPS in England. They're not a court. And just before I came on air here, I had a call from a journalist saying, "Oh, the Crown Office are going to be looking into where you got all this information." To which I'm afraid my response was, tell them to go back and read their law books about parliamentary privilege, But there are grey areas in it. Much of what I said in the chamber was already public domain. I mean, Kenny McCaskill's put some stuff in the public domain, ex Justice Secretary. So it's some of it's at the margin. Some of the text messages were new, and some of the emails were new. They may well fall within privilege, and so I'm going to stay off them. But quite a good chunk of it was actually perfectly possible to do publicly, but had never been done. Had never, so for some reason in Scotland, nobody laid out the sort of narrative of the three great problems: the problem of how they first investigated Salmon, was that fair? The problem of how they behaved with the judicial review, and the problem eventually of the way the Crown Office and the government, the Scottish Government generally, have sought to sort of shut down the review, shut down the access to information, break it up into small pieces, make it more complicated. It needs to be. So it's actually very difficult, even for Scots following it on a day-by-day basis, to understand it all. So the answer to your question is I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to be quite careful in answering your questions today.
Well, let me approach two things, because there are two major issues here. Well, one is, did Nicola Sturgeon mislead Parliament about what did she know and when did she know it about the internal Scottish Government investigation into Alex Salmon? The second is Mr. Salmon's claim that there was a wider conspiracy to do him down. So let me start with the first one. Having reviewed the evidence and looked at the emails and seen what you've seen, is it clear in your mind that Nicola Sturgeon, in terms of what did she know and when did she know it about the complaints process, has been with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people economical with the truth?
The answer is, I don't know. It's pretty plain that she knew about the Salmon investigation, I think on the 28th of March, i.e. 4 days before her claim date of April the 2nd. What is much more concerning is whether she knew much earlier than that. Now, the trouble is, I raised an email in the House which implied that her Chief of Staff knew significantly earlier, but it only implied it. It didn't prove it bang to rights, as it were. But that email or that exchange of messages between the investigating officer and another member of the Scottish Civil Service about, and it had the quote, Liz interference v difficult, or I've forgotten the exact phrasing now, but it's in Hansard. That should have been with the inquiry. That should have been presented without me raising it in Parliament. That should have been presented to the Holyrood Parliamentary Inquiry, and it wasn't. And with it should have been all the stream of messages, all the stream of electronic records that show who Judith McKinnon, the investigating officer, talked to, who the Chief of Staff to the First Minister talked to, really, whether there are any trails showing prior knowledge. That hasn't been done. And if this were a UK parliamentary inquiry, and I were the chairman of it, it would have been done months ago.
And the second big issue is, was there a wider conspiracy to bring down Alex Salmond? If it couldn't bring it down from the Me Too investigation, could they then make it a criminal matter and bring him down that way? Now, many people from the outside have thought this is the bit that's more far-fetched, that there was a conspiracy to try and destroy him. But when you've seen the evidence you've seen and the exchange of emails, it is possible that there was a group of people, including civil servants within the Scottish government and SNP apparatchiks at the highest level, when you see the exchanges and the emails that you've seen, that they were out to bring Alex Salmond down. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I think, look, it may be more than possible. When I first looked at that aspect of it, Alex Salmond made a claim in front of the inquiry, a very strong claim about this. And there's a piece of me that said, he's been under formidable pressure for 3 years. If I'd been in a criminal trial, my judgment might not be right. And so I discounted it, to be honest, in my head. But when I looked at I actually put in order the sequence of text messages, the ones that both in the public domain and a couple that I also revealed. When I put them in order, I thought, actually, this looks quite serious. And the interesting thing was, for me, the most interesting thing, there were references to phishing and there were recurrent discussions with an individual complainant and so on. But the thing that was, for me, most persuasive was that actually within the SNP organisation itself, there were concerns about what was called suborning of witnesses. Joanne Cherry, one of who's a QC, reflected that at the National Executive Council of the SNP and said people in Westminster were worried about, the staff members in Westminster were worried about what was going on. And that seemed to be, if they thought that at that time, and they knew they would have known far more that was in the than was in the text, then there really is a strong case to answer. That was the point I made. There's a prima facie case here. There's a strong case to answer. And if it is true, then it shouldn't actually be the inquiry. Probably, if the Holyrood inquiry won't do it, it perhaps ought to be the police doing it, because it's a very, very serious, very, very serious issue. I'm not an expert in Scottish law, but if I were interfering with or talking to or trying to persuade a witness in a criminal inquiry whilst the police were actually carrying out their inquiry, then I think I'd be breaking the law here. So I do think it needs proper investigation, and so far it hasn't had it.
All right. Let me bring Fraser Nelson in now, who's been listening patiently. Fraser, where does David Davis's intervention leave us, do you think?
Well, the difference now is that the Alex Salmond story has been told in full in the House of Commons. Now, this matters because any other environment, whether it be a Scottish newspaper, the Scottish Parliament, even the Spectator, are subject to the threats of lawyers who can say, look at this, you can't say this and you can't say that, and if you do, we might come after you for contempt of court. Now, the Scottish Parliament itself isn't protected from these lawyers, although the House of Commons is. You can say anything you like in the House of Commons, and not only that, journalists can also report. So the parliamentary privilege is sort of extended in a way to journalists. If they report on what was said in Parliament, we can't be sued for that. So what we have done is taken David Davis's speech and put it word for word on our website so everybody can read it. Now, this has indeed made a difference because it's put into the open something which wasn't really before, and that's the extent to which journalists have been menaced by the Crown Office, and even Scottish parliamentarians have been told they better be careful what they say. And in that way, these are the very, very strange circumstances in which we are trying to tell one of the most explosive stories in modern politics. But Alex Salmond isn't just saying that he thinks that he was wronged by Nicola Sturgeon. He's saying that her allies conspired to have him imprisoned. You don't get allegations more explosive than that in politics. And he might be telling the truth, he might be completely fantasizing. The only way you can decide is if you hear what he has to say, and even hear and you read his written evidence. Now, we put it on our website because his written evidence is a public document. People have got the right in a democracy to hear what's being said against the powerful people running that government. But this is becoming increasingly difficult under increasing censorship. So, in intervening in the House of Commons, David Davis has put a lot of things on the record which might otherwise never have seen the light of day.
And as the Spectator editorial says today, that no Lord Advocate equivalent would dare speak to the Westminster Parliament in that way. It would be inconceivable to do so. But despite all the efforts of the Crown Office to shut it down and to redact and to make very relevant information unpublishable and to try and close the whole debate, there are signs, Fraser, I would suggest, that this is now having at last some cut through. That long line of opinion polls showing a majority for independence has now ended. The latest polls show independents now in the minority. And it looks like it's going to be a much bigger struggle for Nicola Sturgeon to get an overall majority in the May elections than it did only a couple of months ago. Is that right?
I'd say so, and that's because I think the debate is slightly changing. Up until now, most normal people couldn't get their heads around why it mattered if Nicola Sturgeon said a meeting had taken place on the 2nd of April or the 28th of March. It seemed to be a lot of fuss about nothing, but it's becoming clearer now that there's a new problem, a new scandal, and that simply is of SNP overreach, of the emergence pretty much of a one-party state in Scotland. When it's got the majority, it's got control of the courts, there's no separation of powers, so it can get the lawyers to menace the press. And this creates a second question. Does Nicola Sturgeon deserve a majority if this is how she uses it? Will it be the case that the Scottish democratic system is now being threatened by an overpowerful government which is overreaching in its powers? Now, just as Theresa May was not given a majority in her general election, people thought, yes, you're better than Jeremy Corbyn, but you're behaving in a bit of a power-hungry way. You do not deserve a big majority. Maybe Scots are beginning to think the same about Nicola Sturgeon. That yes, you're probably a better First Minister candidate than the rest, but do you really deserve to have majority power when we now know and we see examples of that power being abused? I think that's when a lot of people are having second thoughts.
And meanwhile, the Crown Office is still trying to shut you down. The Crown Office still wants you to take out or redact substantially Alex Salmond's submission to the parliamentary inquiry. This despite the fact the Spectator went to court. The judge raised no objections to doing it. It's been up and is still up now for many weeks. It kind of beggars belief, the behaviour of the Crown Office now, does it not?
It's incredible. Well, Alex Salmond's evidence has been on our website for a couple of months now. And only now does the Crown, after he gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament, does the Crown Office get in touch saying, actually, we'd like you to redact this and this and this and this, a long line of things they'd like us to censor, which do not, as they pretend, identify any complainants against Alex Salmond, but they do contain lots of embarrassing allegations against the behaviour of Nicola Sturgeon's government. So now we are being asked to redact, to censor things that have been on our website for a couple of months. And the thing is, if we say no, it is absolutely unpredictable what would then happen to us. The Crown Office says we'll be criminally liable. Well, perhaps we would. But then what sort of charge would we face? We've been advised we could have a fee of about £50,000. Now, that is a lot of money for a small publication like ours, but it could be more than that. It could be up to £100,000. There is no cap. So what we're doing here is we're telling our readers this is what's happening. These are the threats that we're under, and this is the position. We, as a publisher, we could probably afford to take it if it were reasonable damages, but we couldn't afford to take a 6-figure fine. Now, if we haven't still decided what we're going to do here, but what we are going to do is be completely transparent with readers every step of the way and let people know what's going on behind the scenes to stop journalists reporting the story and to stop the whole truth from coming out.
David Davis, your interventions had an impact. There's no question about that. It's also, though, it almost raises more questions that need answered that have been answered so far. Where do you go from here? What can you do now?
Well, I think the first thing is, I remember that the context of the debate was about what we do about the what Westminster set up in the way of the Holyrood Parliament. You know, we didn't establish separation of powers, and that needs to happen. In other words, a separate Director of Public Prosecutions over whom Nicola Sturgeon or whichever First Minister has no power whatsoever. We do need to do something about the Scottish Civil Service, which is sort of treated as a sort of division of the UK Civil Service, but without controls, without checks and balances, without ensuring it's independent and so on. And we certainly need to do something about Holyrood's power to hold the government to account. I mean, look, Scotland had an absolute dominance of Labour MPs back before devolution, the early years of devolution. Now it's got an absolute dominance of SNP MPs. And what we see under those circumstances is serial misuse of power. That's the only way I can describe it. You know, that this should not happen. You know, the Holyrood should not be craven in front of their government. When you may remember, Andrew, when Damien Green was arrested for getting whistleblower information, it ended up with Michael Martin, the Speaker, effectively being sacked, losing his job because he let the police into Westminster. It ended up with Keir Starmer, then the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, having to say there's no case to answer. And it ended up with Damien Green being released because we maintain the separation of powers. And those same protections should exist for MSPs. And I believe that. Henry McLeish this morning came out saying the same thing, an ex-First Minister of Scotland. Kenny McCaskill, the ex-Justice Secretary, said, and I know a number of my Tory colleagues north of the border, both MSPs and MPs, think it's also the case. So I will argue, and I will argue to my own party, we should make this a part of our manifesto, that actually any government in Scotland should actually be face proper checks and balances, both in the judiciary and in the legal sector, and also in Parliament. And only that way will you guarantee that the Scots actually get the government they deserve. But
final point to you, David. These are structural changes, which will take some time to implement. They will not affect what is currently going on in Scotland or the current inquiry. Are you minded to use Parliament to reveal any more information that would be helpful in the public domain? And if the Crown Office is still trying to redact a chunk of Mr. Salmon's submission, would you consider reading these redacted parts of the submission into the Hansard record under parliamentary privilege?
Well, certainly if necessary, because like you, I don't believe what the redactions. I'm actually your readers can tell by comparing what you've published and what the Scottish Parliament's published, what the redactions are. And they're not to protect complainants, they are to protect Nicola Sturgeon. So the answer is yes, certainly I do that. But the truth is, it wouldn't even be necessary. There's a Wayback Machine. In California, on the internet, you can go and look, not just at your publications, you go and look at the Scottish Parliament's previous publications, and they won't respond to the Crown Office because they're there to deal with sort of tin-pot dictatorships and authoritarian regimes who want their information covered up. They certainly won't pay any attention to the Scottish Crown Office. So one way or another, yes. And I think if you get forced to the position where you have to take it down, I would be very inclined to find a mechanism for entrenching it in Hansard for all time.
All right, David Davis, thank you. That authoritarian regimes, which some may now wish to add the current Scottish government. into that category. David Davis, thank you for joining us. Fraser Nelson too. If there's two things that you should read this week, one is David Davis's speech in the Commons. It's all on the Spectator website, all printed word for word there exactly as he delivered it. And second is the Spectator editorial on this matter. It's a powerful editorial for press freedom and revealing the extent to which the Crown Office in Scotland is trying to close it down. That's it for this week. Thanks to all of our guests and once again to our very special sponsor, Charles Stanley, for sponsoring the week in 60 Minutes. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms. It's one of the oldest firms on the London Stock Exchange. As always, send us any thoughts you have to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. And please join us next week. Bye-bye.